Chapter 6. The history surrounding the Pink House of Shepherd's Crook is long, ominous, and surprisingly well documented. Since nothing says, "Wouldn't you like to donate to the Shepherd's Crook Historical Society?" quite like a haunted house. The structure was originally built in 1678 for an unknown English gentleman. He took up residence in 1679 and lived there less than a year before mysterious and violent circumstances led to his disappearance. Modern historians agree that he was likely the victim of persecution on trumped-up charges, based on the presence of infamous witchfinder Erasmus Martin. Honorary reverendship given, stripped, given again, stripped again, and now being reconsidered by the Shepherd's Crook Community College, formerly the Martha Institute of Greater Theology, the Northern Massachusetts College of Science and the Arts, the Martha Institute of Revivalist Theology, and the All Faith Universal University of Greater Enlightenment and Understanding. After that initial owner, the house was left empty for nearly 50 years by the nearby Puritans, who were quite happy to leave well enough alone. Thank you very much. Then, beginning in 1728, a series of poor Bostonians seeking cheap land occupied the building. This period marked by a 1,000% increase in murders, suicides, and ritual cannibalism lasted until 1734, when a family of Quakers moved in. Locals started calling the place cursed after that. The house saw action in 2 wars during the 18th century. During the French and Indian War, tragedy befell a small scout force of French soldiers who'd taken refuge there during a battle. Historians outside Shepherd's Crook call it a skirmish, or more often, a something happened, with Shepherd's Crook's plucky native sons. The siege that followed lasted exactly 1 hour, and mainly consisted of the local militia drinking tea outside while waiting for the screams to end. Just over a decade later, it was chosen by the British during the War of Independence as the site for the most disastrously unsuccessful battlefield hospital in the history of battlefields, hospitals, or staying alive. Doctors and historians still disagree as to why, despite above-average sanitation for the time, every injured soldier who had been treated there, whether it be for the bullet hole or a dose of the clap, had died of acute anemia. For most of the next century, the house fell into abandonment and disrepair, which was just fine with the citizenry, with occasional bouts of habitation by Irish, German, and Italian immigrants, which was decidedly not. Fortunately, the stays of these foreigners were brief, and punctuated by a night when each family ran screaming into the woods, never to be heard from again. This usually warranted a town-wide day of Thanksgiving. Following the hurried departure of a Norwegian couple in 1855, a group of otherwise well-intentioned abolitionists thought to use the Pink House, at this point a fairly awful shade of ramshackle, as a shelter for runaway slaves. After a single night, the former slaves told the abolitionists exactly what they could do with this particular safe house. When pressed, the escapees spoke of queer dreams in which an old white devil drank from their very souls. The Underground Railroad gave Shepherd's Crook a wide berth in the future. "We may be desperate," said one of its conductors, "but we're not crazy." In 1891, a visiting Boston architect decided to restore the edifice to its former glory, despite the resounding disapproval of the locals. He would spend the next 3 years and much of his fortune on the renovation, after which he died drunk, destitute, and alone. Though strictly speaking, this wasn't the house's fault. The rebuilt residence then fell into the hands of New York Railroad magnate Gerard D. Huff, whose family traveled there seasonally well into the next century. With occultism all the rage among the upper crust, Mrs. Stephanie Huff would often host seances and Sabbaths for her friends and famous guests. At this time, however, the spirits were not very forthcoming. Even the notorious occultist Aleister Crowley, who could raise a spirit out of a snuff-box, was unable to find a single solitary soul, though he had looked rather angry after trying. During the post-seance orgy, he was overheard muttering to himself, "Show him I'm not a Puritan." Over the next 50 years, very little of interest occurred in the dwelling, except for a dozen deaths by Spanish flu, the murder of an abusive husband, the last stand of a Boston gangster, a war of the worlds incited suicide pact, 5 dismembered pets, and 27 missing children who had entered on a dare, the same as any old house. In fact, when the 60s and 70s came around with their own brands of occultism and spiritual interest, the hippies squatting in the building, locals started calling the house cursed again, were disappointed that nary a ghostly presence could be found. Never ones to remain disheartened, they did what any reasonable proponents of peace and love would do on a boatload of LSD. They painted the house pink. The Shepherd's Crook Historical Society is still having fits. The legend of the pink house died out after that. When authors and film buffs were falling over themselves to find the next Amityville Horror or Overlook Hotel, they passed through Shepherd's Crook with hardly a second thought beyond, "My, what an ugly house!" As the town slowly suburbanized, all traces of its unique and colorful history were willfully forgotten by a community longing for uniformity. All that remained was a generic ghost story, used for fundraising, and the Journal of Erasmus Martin, kept by the Shepherd's Crook Historical Society, and only ever read by 2 people, the Society's sole 8-year-old member, and after a time, his sister. This long and rambling history is intended to illustrate that the house, over the centuries lived in, inhabited, commandeered, and otherwise populated by various people, have never been owned by any of them, only rented. The rights to the dwelling were still held in trust by a very old and powerful Swiss bank, in the name of one Master Ulrich Dunwulf Bile.